Today I'll show you The Accountant, a 2016 thriller film. Watch out for spoilers and take precautions. A couple takes their son Chris to an autistic institute in the hopes of gaining some insight. They explain that because their husband is in the army, they must relocate frequently, and the director offers to let Chris reside there. Husband refuses, stating that Chris does not need to be kept away from the things that irritate him. He must be compelled to cope with them since that is how the world functions. Chris chants sings nursery rhymes to himself while working on a puzzle in a waiting area. He gets down to the last piece but can't find it and begins to cry. He calms down as a little girl finds the missing piece and delivers it to him. Chris now works as an accountant. He sits in his office with a couple who is having financial difficulties and educates them on how to file their taxes in order to save the maximum money. They are grateful, and the husband offers to let Chris shoot on their land whenever he wants. A man named King is the director of the United States Treasury, calls an analyst Medina into his office to speak with her, praising her efforts and questioning why she hasn't advanced. She claims she enjoys nothing more than being an analyst, but he accuses her of lying. He looks up her arrest records from her adolescence and tells her that lying on a federal job application is unlawful, and that her record should have barred her from receiving the job. He tells her that if she wants to keep her job, she must work on a special project for him. He gives her photos of the accountant and all of the criminals he works with. He assists them in keeping track of their unlawful money and has been known to take lives. The monarch tells Medina that she must figure out who this individual is and solve the case before the end of the month, or she would lose her job. Chris returns home, cooks himself dinner, and before going to bed, he turns on strobe lights, heavy metal music, and cruelly rubs his shins with a wooden rod. He recalls his mother abandoning their family at Christmas when he was a child. Chris takes his prescription and goes to bed. Later, he goes to his client's farm to practice shooting, and the man is amazed at how excellent Chris is. Drives to his storage unit, where he stores his trailer, and inside he has incredibly expensive artifacts and paintings in various currencies. He also possesses a big arsenal of weaponry. He lies down on his bed and gets a flashback to his time in prison. His cellmate mentored him, teaching him various social skills and preparing him for his job handling money for dangerous criminals. Chris awakens to the sound of his phone ringing and answers it. A British woman who clearly works for him urges him to pick up some regular clients because she can tell people are becoming suspicious of him. He reluctantly agrees to take on a typical customer, and he attends a meeting with his new clients, who own a robotics prosthetics company. One of their internal auditors discovered that someone within the organization is stealing money from their profits, and they want to hire Chris to figure out what's going on. Chris accepts the job and promises to start the next morning. Medina searches through her photos and zooms in on one with a portion of the accountant's face visible. She crops the image and sends it to the face mapping team for examination. Brax, a deadly man hired to make businessmen accountable for money laundering, enters a man's car in a Swiss parking garage before he can drive away. He places a gun to his head and demands that he cease shorting other firms' money. Brax has to beat him up, but eventually the man agrees and leaves. Chris enters the conference room where he has been granted permission to work for the corporation and discovers a woman asleep at the conference table. He wakes her up awkwardly, and she apologizes. She identifies herself as Dana, the woman who discovered the missing money in the first place. She gives him an overview of the problem and believes they'll be working together, but Chris expresses his preference for working alone. Chris goes to work after she leaves the meeting room. During a news appearance, Medina receives a phone call from Homeland Security with a facial recognition request in which they have detected an audio recording from one of his attacks of a man begging for his life just before the accountant murders. They email the audio file to Medina. At lunch, Dana sits next to Chris and tries to strike up a conversation. Chris does his hardest to mingle, but it's evident that he's not very good at it. Dana discusses her father and how he inspired her to pursue a career in accounting. Chris returns to the conference room and conducts so much arithmetic on the provided whiteboard that he is forced to continue on the surrounding windows. He works his way around the room until he makes a breakthrough. Medina listens to the audio recording repeatedly at home and isolates it using her equipment. She can hear the accountant repeating a nursery rhyme to himself over his vocals. Chris proudly shows Dana his work in the conference room and informs her that he has discovered a money leak. Someone is directing funds to a non-existent company. One of the company's shareholders interrupts them and demands Chris for results, but he tells her that he doesn't have a definite answer yet. and that he needs more time to determine who is taking the money. Brax pays a visit to one of the robotics company's shareholders at his home in the middle of the night and orders him to get insulin from the fridge and bring it over to the table, where he can either inject himself with the insulin and make his death appear to be a suicide so that his wife can collect on his life insurance policy, or he can fight back and Brax will kill both him and his wife. The man decides to self-inject. The next day, as Chris arrives at the conference room, custodians are inside erasing his work off the windows. He begs them to halt, and the firm's owner enters to explain that his best friend, the shareholder, committed suicide last night due to remorse over stealing money from the company, and he asks Chris to cease working on the case. Chris feels disappointed that he was unable to complete the project he began. Chris returns home and engages in a hard session of shin slapping with his wooden rod while listening to heavy metal music and turning on the strobe lights. He gets another flashback of his mother abandoning the family, and he breaks the rod over his shin and tosses his medication bottle. He calms down, takes his medication, and goes to bed. When he leaves the house the next morning, an automobile follows him. When Chris goes to his client's property to practice shooting, he has a childhood memory of battling with his brother Brax and a trainer his father hired. They are beaten by the trainer and are covered in cuts and bruises. The trainer wants to call it a day, but their father insists they haven't had enough. He forces the boys to stand and fight. Two thugs are holding the two clients hostage inside the house. They demand that the wife go outside and summon Chris so that they can approach him. Chris shoots a thug from the yard as he leads her to the front door. The other thug forces the couple into their truck and drives them away from their home. Chris fires at the truck, causing it to come to a halt, and drags the thug from the vehicle. Chris strangles the man with his belt and demands to know who he works for. The man claims he has no idea who is in charge and that he was told to kill Chris and Dana. Chris murders the man and flees the property for Dana's house. Dana is followed to her apartment complex by a man, and Chris arrives just in time to see him enter the elevator with her. Chris enters the building from the back and climbs the stairs. Dana arrives at her apartment, and two delivery men inform her that she has a package. They barge into her apartment and attempt to subdue her, but she fights back and flees to the bathroom. Chris breaks into the apartment, murders the two men, and invites Dana to join him. Brax receives word that one of his men has been murdered by the accountant. Chris drives Dana to his trailer and instructs her to wait outside while he prepares. She still comes inside and sees all of his money and weapons. She confronts him about them, but he is unable to provide direct answers. Chris takes Dana to a posh hotel to hide out, and she interrogates him about his fighting skills. He tells her that his father was in the army and trained him to stand up to bullies. He also informs her that he has autism, and that, despite his best efforts, he finds it difficult to socialize. Dana tells him about a dress she really wanted in high school, and how she learned to gamble and count cards so she could afford it. She only wore it once, but she wanted to blend in with the other kids. Dana leans in to kiss him after they share an emotional moment. However, Chris pulls away after making a revelation about the robotics case. He informs her that someone was taking money out of the company only to put it back in and make even more money. Later, Chris follows Brax down the street, which Brax notices and shoots at. Chris follows him and ends up in one of the shareholders' hotel rooms, where he discovers she's been shot dead. Medina works with an employee at the IRS office and discovers the accountant's real name, Chris, and that he works as an accountant at a small firm in a building connected to a slew of cash businesses that he owns and uses to conceal how much he makes. Medina calls King and informs him that the majority of Chris's earnings are donated to neuroscience organizations. When Chris returns to the hotel, he discovers Dana asleep on the couch. He recalls his father forcing him and his brother to beat up a group of kids who had bullied him earlier that day at school. Chris decides that keeping Dana involved is too dangerous, so he packs his belongings and leaves. King and Medina lead a team of investigators through Chris's home, noting all of his unusual living habits. They discover that he has a large number of weapons with no serial numbers in a high-tech security system. The owner of the robotics company hires Brax to install security cameras in his home in case Chris comes after him. The King dismisses the other investigators and stays in the house with Medina to talk. He asks Medina to tell him about her arrest, and she tells him that she attempted to kill a drug dealer who was selling drugs to her sister, and that she doesn't regret her decisions.